Gotta love the breaks because it gives me an opportunity to introduce our great guest, Nicole DeBorde from Texas, Houston, Texas. How are you there, Nicole?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. And so we haven't been on together, but I always ask, what's the background? And I was really happy and elated to hear you were a former prosecutor, defense attorney, and you've been involved in police shooting cases on both ends, as I have. That's right, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so listen, we got the cross-examination, and I was just telling Rachel Stockman that, you know, when she was hosting before, that's always interesting when you have a case where one officer shoots and the other officer isn't shooting, what observations were being made and why one would and why one wouldn't. What do you think of this testimony so far from the partner?
You know, I think some of it's helpful and some of it's not. One of the things he said really caught my attention, which is that he was scared when the vehicle started moving quickly, but he didn't think that the vehicle was going to strike him. That really kind of cuts to the heart of the matter here, because deadly force is appropriate in response to potentially deadly force. And if that officer, at a minimum, didn't think that he was about to be struck by a vehicle, it does bring into question whether or not the person who discharged his weapon should have reasonably perceived that he was in imminent danger of being killed.
Right, and you know, Nicole, one of the things that people don't get in these police-related encounters is that it's very discretionary on the level of force that they're allowed to use, and not all officers necessarily have to follow exactly the same level of force. And what the defense attorney, I believe, is doing here, which would be typical, is that maybe the defendant is seeing things that the partner is not seeing, and that's why there was a different reaction. Is that what you're getting from this cross-examination so far?
That's definitely what I'm getting. And it really does come down to perspective. And the police officers really do need to be free to use the appropriate amount of force for the circumstance that they are personally in. So the officer who may be standing only a few feet away may have a completely different perspective on the situation, and they could both be right.
Right, and another thing, when I talk to a lot of my friends, I just want to throw a little curveball here for our viewers and our great people that are in the chat room at the Law&Crime Network. And I mean no disrespect by this, but there's also temperamentally unfit police officers. That is, officers that have previous histories of doing some things that aren't necessarily suitable for the profession, that wind up in these scenarios. Because let's face it, most cops, most 90+%, 95% never fire their firearm in 25 and 30-year careers. And what do you think about that, real quick, in 15 seconds or less?
You know, I think that that's the biggest problem that they have. You know, most of the time people don't have to use it. And this guy's made a decision that's a very unique and rare one, and he's now in a position to have to defend it to a jury.
Excellent.
And that's the heart of the matter.
Right. Well, here we are at the Law&Crime Network. Gavel to gavel coverage is a fascinating case right up the alley of both myself and Nicole. Can't wait to get to more of this Law&Crime right after the break. See you then. Okay, Nicole, typically I like to do some funny stuff on the show because we deal with some heavy things. We got about 2 minutes to talk about this. Let's go to the funny one. The knife pointing case of Jean-Claude Van Damme's son. Do you think, Nicole, that he would be a little upset that the manner and weapon that he used was a knife as opposed to like a karate chop or his legs or a punch? I mean, is this not disrespectful to the lineage of his father?
Yeah, no, I think that, you know, obviously he must have been acting out of total desperation. Clearly he's forgotten the lessons his father taught him if he's resorted to weaponry.
Yeah, I mean, you're supposed to have your hands as the lethal weapons, not a knife. I would be disgusted with my son. I happen to have a martial arts background if he had used a knife or a gun as opposed to like 2 fingers in the eyes. Anyway, that's just my point of view. But on a more serious note, Molly Tibbetts, this is this missing person case. Law enforcement's been very quiet about it for a considerable period of time. And while we are in the media and we are out here trying to help people find Molly Tibbetts, these unnamed sources in law enforcement that release data, I think, and I'm not talking about the media reporting it, that's the job that we're supposed to do, but I'm a little disconcerted. And when I was the prosecutor, if I had found that out and I found out who released that information, they not only would be out of my office in a heartbeat, they could be prosecuted.
I have to agree. It can make it really difficult to sort out who has actual factual information and who has gossip. And right now, they really need to get correct, actual facts and information to make sure that they're on the right track. And this can be devastating to an investigation.
Yeah, and not only devastating for investigation, the primary thing that we do when we're looking for missing persons, especially somebody who may be abducted or kidnapped or something of that nature, is not only not tip off the suspect, but not scare the suspect that they think that they need to do something draconian in order to avoid detection. So it's really disappointing to me that those sources, did that, and I hope that it ceases at this point. But in any event, Nicole, we are dealing with the testimony of this police officer, this partner. He's already off the stand. He gave previous testimony. I think he's going to be a pretty devastating witness to the defendant in this case, his partner, who was basically accused of having shot right through a window and killing a 15-year-old boy and 4 counts of aggravated assault. That's the testimony of Tyler Gross. So we're going to go back to that. And on the other end of that clip, I want to discuss a little bit more about police practices, what they're trained, and why I think we're seeing more shootings based upon that training. Okay, welcome back. We got a little time before the witness, Vidal Allen, actually speaks. This is the stepbrother of Jordan Edwards. Let me explain to you what happened here. Thank you, Kathy Russin from the Law&Crime Network. She's on top of it. It's a 104 hearing, which is a hearing outside the presence of the jury to determine whether or not a witness or a piece of evidence will be admitted. Little interesting to me, because what the argument here is that the body cam footage that apparently the prosecutor had showed Mr. Allen was being argued. Is he testifying about what he saw on a body cam, or is he testifying from his own independent recollection? And typically speaking, while it's a valid area of cross-examination during the course of the trial, Nicole, that usually doesn't go to admissibility so much as it goes to the weight. But the weight of the evidence, that is, the jury makes a determination as to what value they'll give it. But there must have been something so compelling that they thought, or at least argued, that he only is testifying about what he saw on the body cam, and the judge was making a determination. If so, then he was not going to allow him to testify. We got to get to it quick, but do you agree with that assessment?
I totally agree with that assessment. You know, it's kind of a cross between an identification hearing, an admissibility hearing, and a competency hearing. It's creative. I have to give him that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he got a couple questions in there, and now he knows, the lawyer, how much and how far he can push this kid. He gets to know his temperature. He gets to know whether he can push his buttons or not. He gets to know some facts before he goes back in and testifies before the jury, which you can be assured he's going to make a big point that you're testifying because essentially a prosecutor stuck in your face a body cam video, and that this recollection is not independent. Thank you, Kathy Russin from the Law&Crime Network, and all you guys in the back that make this happen. Let's get to court. Okay, well, there's a stepbrother, and we were just talking. I don't know what your feelings are on this, Nicole, but the prosecutor is doing, I think, a tremendous job at doing two things. One, calming the witness down a little bit, because it's a very intimidating environment to be sitting in that chair with 12, 14, 16 jurors staring at you, a whole courtroom of people, and he's a young man. The second thing he's doing is really humanizing these kids, regular teenagers. In fact, we know from this case, the evidence was produced that the victim in the case begged for weeks to go to this party, and they're talking about going and getting chips and girls. It is a great baseline to show that these kids are just decent kids, decent teenagers going about their lives. Look at these pictures. What do you think about so far what we're seeing?
You couldn't be more right. I mean, it's just devastating hearing about the regular day-to-day teenage things these kids were doing, and you know, the jury's hearing it. It's an incredibly smart line of questions to personalize this witness and set the stage for what happens next.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, I think we're going to find out, in the case if it hasn't come out already, that this was a, quote, great kid, a great football player, a straight-A student. I'm talking about Jordan, who was actually shot and killed. Obviously, his stepbrother's making a very good appearance so far. And the police officer has, you know, some little bit of a problematic history, too. So if that is allowed to be admitted, you know the prosecutor's going to try to balance one against the other and say the victim comes out on top. We got 15 seconds. What are your thoughts?
I agree. I mean, you know, they're spending a lot of time making the person who's never going to be in the courtroom a part of this trial. And that's going to be juxtaposed with the police officer and his conduct and his past history. Absolutely.
We'll get back to it on the other end of this break. Welcome back. I'm here with Nicole. I think you're still there with us. We have a little. Okay, excellent. We got a little bit of choppiness going on inside the courtroom with that testimony. I don't believe that he's at a critical state right now. That is the stepbrother, although I think he's going to provide some fascinating testimony because he was there. And while we're cleaning that up, that gives us an opportunity to go back a little bit more to what I was saying before about police officer training. You know, Nicole, when I was prosecutor, I actually, as a lawyer, went through the Police Training Commission use of force and firearms training. I was the only prosecutor that did it. I always wanted to know, because we're in court, always second-guessing police officers and what they do in the calm, antiseptic courtroom. But I wanted to know what the training was like. I think it was the singular best, most educational thing I did. And we definitely see an increase in police shootings. And I think it has some level to do with some of the training that most people would be surprised they get. What are your thoughts before I get into mine?
You know, I agree. That training should be something that every prosecutor who handles any kind of case involving force use of force, by a civilian, just understand the principles behind when deadly force may or may not be appropriate. But if you're going to be handling a case involving police officers and police officers' use of force, this is absolutely training that the prosecution should have. And quite frankly, any attorney who's handling these cases should have as well.
Well, I always refer to, in the 6 years that I was the head prosecutor, there was a law enforcement officer that was in my agency that I think was the most brilliant cop, and I've been doing this a long time, that I ever met. He was just brilliant in how he approached law enforcement, his philosophy. There was no one that never gave him a statement or a confession. In fact, he's the only guy I've ever heard of that the argument by the defense to suppress a confession was that he was too nice to people. He was just a master. And when I've been asking him about this, like, why do we see an increase in this? Here's what he told me. And on a police stop myself that I was on, I get it. It's an amped up situation, especially if there's gunshots that are alleged to be fired. The cops don't know where it's coming from, who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. And when they're doing a motor vehicle stop, it's funny, I watch how their whole temperament changes from good, easygoing people like the friend that I'm talking about to a very command-oriented thing, because they're trained the number one way you will be killed is in a motor vehicle related scenario, especially when there's furtive movement. You heard this being discussed in this case, because at any given point in time somebody can pull a gun out and kill you, and that's the fastest way not to go home. Is that basically the training that they're getting in your area?
Absolutely, and the force training. It sounds like you took something from the Force Science Institute. That's the leading training institute for these types of cases or for these types of use of force trainings. And they say that, and you know, they have videos of police officers walking up to cars and being shot and killed. It's horrifying to see. It happens so fast, and the officer is always at a disadvantage because they're approaching a vehicle. The vehicle provides the person inside concealment, and so the officer can't see what's happening until they're right there. And when they're right there, that's when they're in the most danger in a very short period of time.
I've got time for one more question for you, but there's multiple levels that I'd love to give you his opinions on, because it's a complex subject. But the other thing that he says, which I find interesting, is that while they've got more tools for police officers to use less than lethal force, that would be things like stun guns and batons and things of that nature, he finds that while it may not necessarily be illegal, they're resorting to deadly force far faster than they used to, because they're being trained not to put hands on people because of lawsuits and things of that nature, where he said in the old days we would have grabbed the guy out of the car, we would have wrestled him down on the ground. Today cops aren't being trained to tussle, so they resort quicker to the lethal force. Do you agree with that concept?
You know, I'd be very curious to see the numbers. I can definitely agree that police officers feel concerned that they're going to be criticized by not only their departments for using any kind of physical contact whatsoever, but potentially sued. And that's definitely something that's on their minds. And it does absolutely change the way that they react. And unfortunately, it can mean that somebody else dies because they end up using deadly force too quickly on that continuum, or it can mean that they're injured severely or killed because they're not reacting like they should, because they're worried about things that really shouldn't come into play.
Right, and we could, on the other end of what we're about to do next, because it's going to be fascinating, we're going to talk a little bit about police-community relations contributing to this, and we're going to also talk about internal affairs and temperamentally unfit officers that are not removed fast enough. But let's get to something more on point with this case. Let's get to the actual video footage of the shooting itself. Wow, that's the first I've seen. I'm overwhelmed by looking at that. I mean, you know, there's a constellation of things that are happening. Cops are out there doing their job, talking to some teenagers who are really doing innocent kid things. Gunshots are fired. Now, I have goosebumps right now. Listening to this, and thank God we have these video cameras now. Gunshots are fired, people are running out. Clearly they thought the car was related to the shooting, but for our viewers, the shooting had nothing to do with these kids. It was an unrelated incident. I believe it was at a nursing home, but you know, people are putting 2 and 2 together and getting 6 or 7. You understand why the cops are running out there, the car's backing up, and of course I look at it from the kids' point of view, the car backing up, that are hearing gunshots being fired and are like, let me get the hell out of here. Here are these poor kids, especially this young man, who had to beg his parents for weeks, a straight A student, to go to this party, and they're told, what do we always tell kids? If there's something bad going on, get out. Don't stay there. Don't be cool. You know, you don't want to get dragged into it. And it's just a constellation of these things happening, and now this kid is dead. I don't know. What were your thoughts? I got to be honest with you. I was just like, I couldn't believe what I was watching there.
It's horrible. I mean, the sound of the shots absolutely immediately escalates this situation from a very normal investigation to an emergency situation. It makes complete sense that the officers are now on very high alert and doing everything they can to make sure that they're safe and that everybody at the party is safe. That part bodes well, I think, for the defendant in this case. What doesn't bode particularly well for him is the constant efforts to tell them to stop the car, stop the car. People who are not involved in law enforcement may or may not realize is that it is not appropriate to use deadly force to stop a vehicle in most instances. And if that's what he was doing, he's got big problems.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, that was something that we definitely were trained on. I don't know if that's a universal principle, but you do not shoot into a moving vehicle. But we also know that, you know, we have to be honest. We've been around the block for a while. There are policies and procedures that should be followed. I'm not saying they shouldn't. But if you were to talk a cop on the street, they're like, hey, I got a real world job to do with real world victims. I don't know, somebody just got murdered over there. I got a car pulling away. You know, they believe fleeing the scene. And it could have been as innocent as I want to get away, just like everybody else was screaming and wanted to get away. And it's it's a tragic thing. But I do agree in the end with some principles that some of the community members that used to come to me said, is that in the end, the cops have the guns, the cops have the badge, the cops have the training. And, you know, usually, and I think you would agree with this, it really comes down to, were they right in the use of even though they may be technically wrong by the policy, but did they get the right guy? For example, if that was the shooter, this I don't think would have been an indictment. But these was an innocent, straight A, decent football playing kid, and that probably made the difference between whether he was called defendant, the cop, or hero.
I agree with that largely, but I think that the big distinction there is that if the kid or if somebody in that vehicle had in fact been a shooter, an active shooter at a party, it's very possible that the police officer still would have been disciplined by his department if what he was doing is shooting at a vehicle that was trying to flee. If he was shooting at a vehicle because he thought he was about to be struck by the vehicle, that's a completely different situation, and it sounds like the defense is trying to establish testimony in that regard. Well, but we just heard that tape, and it sounds a lot like stop that car, and that seems to be his priority, and that's absolutely not a good reason to shoot at a vehicle.
Right, absolutely. But there's a big difference between calling a defendant in a criminal case and being one in a disciplinary action. We got to go to a break. Great analysis here. Appreciate it. We'll be back. Okay, I'm Bob Bianchi from Law&Crime Network. Always love hosting the show. Got another hour. I got Nicole DeBorde with me from Houston, Texas. Listen, great former prosecutor, defense attorney. I'm still compelled by that video, and I love going to our chat room people. We have two that are very regular people, and they're all great and wonderful. Baltimore Joe and BB314 actually say something that I think really hits to the heart of the matter. Where there can be both sides arguing, that is the community versus the police and vice versa. So Baltimore Joe says, essentially. Maybe they didn't know the police were the ones yelling. And, you know, this is an interesting thing. There's pandemonium breaking out here. Even the cops, they're running and they see a car. There's people screaming. Who knows if they either heard the police officers or if they did, whether they were police officers or not. Because if a guy is making a shooting at me and he's saying, stop your car, I'm not about to do that. So that's a very legitimate point. And before, the question I'm going to ask you is the influx or interplay of these things. BB314, another regular commentator here, says, it's always better to follow the officer's commands, which, by the way, I'm always saying, and there seems to even be pushback with that, about following officers' commands, which is obviously a common sense thing to do. But that, of course, assumes he's right, but it assumes that they knew they were officers. And you know what? Even if they knew they were officers, if shots are flying, I don't know, even myself, who's a law enforcement supporter, that I would prosecute somebody who did not follow an officer's command in the middle of a shootout. What are your thoughts?
I have to agree, and the watcher, the viewer makes an excellent point, because the reality is that with all that chaos and shouting, it's impossible to know whether those kids ever heard what those police officers were saying and whether they thought it was a police officer saying those things. These kids were doing the right thing by trying to get the heck out of that situation, and it's impossible to know what they thought at that point. The reality is that anybody who's getting instructions from a police officer should always try to follow those instructions, and quite frankly, they should, even if they believe that those instructions are not fair or not correct, because it's definitely better to argue about those finer points in a courtroom than have your family talking about it at your funeral. It's just not a risk worth taking.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you just said, other than I believe if I found myself in a scenario where shots are being fired and my wife is in the vehicle and I'm worried about their safety and the cop's telling me, hold on there, I'm taking off. And I think that that's a justifiable thing, but I get your point completely. Listen, sorry about a little bit of spotty audio inside the courtroom, but Vidal Allen, the stepbrother, nice kid so far, at least that's how it appears, is on the stand. Let's get back into court. I think that's been resolved. There you go. Well, there's the stepbrother, and Nicole, I think he's providing some decent testimony. Probably they're trying to cross him with some maybe potential inconsistencies. He seems to be credible, a little edgy, very well prepared. You could tell it's the I don't recall when he needs to say I don't recall. Yes, sir, and no, sir. He's keeping his answers short, and that typically shows me he's been well prepared by the prosecution. Thoughts?
I totally agree. And now we have the answer to the question. Who did he think was hollering at him? And I think the kid, unfortunately for the defendant, makes a pretty good point. It's pretty surprising to hear that type of language coming from an authority figure if you're a teenager. So I can understand, while he's hearing gunshots and he's hearing chaos, that he might not be so inclined to follow instructions from someone saying the things he was hearing.
Yeah, and this is exactly what we had talked about just before we heard that part of the testimony, that there's pandemonium occurring, and you don't know whether somebody's telling you to stop because they're looking to do harm to you, and there's flashing lights going on, there's gunshots going off. I mean, it's just really sad. But in the end analysis, what this case is about now is whether it was a justifiable use of deadly force, especially in light of the fact that cops have to be, I know they got a tough job. God knows I know that. I'm a cop supporter, but this wasn't even a shooting that had anything to do with these kids. This was something completely separate and distinct. And somehow the car started to back up, and they just presumed these were probably the people acting.
Yeah, a lot of conclusions were made that really didn't have any basis. And unfortunately, that's part of what a police officer has to do, is make judgments in a very short period of time under very high stress. And in this circumstance, they were just wrong.
Right. Well, listen, this is why you got to love the Law and Crime Network, Nicole, because they give us these cases. They find them that are amazing. They give us great legal insights. Police cases are always important for community relations. We'll be back on the other end. Well, Vidal Allen is off the stand. There was just a couple more questions on cross, a very, very quick redirect. That's the stepbrothers driving the vehicle. He went undamaged as far as I'm concerned, as far as his testimony. Compelling case. I'm here with Nicole DeBorde. I want to go, Nicole, back to the shooting real quick and have our viewers take a look and breaking this down. And let's keep in mind what this young man just said. Pandemonium breaking out. I don't know if the cops are cops, not cops. I hear somebody saying stop the vehicle. Let's take a look at it and see how this confluence of factors can create such a tragic result. So, Nicole, I'll give my disclaimer that a video does not show everything, and we have seen many times that there's been other evidence introduced that either explains the context, so on and so forth. But what I saw, while it was a harried situation, activity going on and pandemonium breaking out, gunshots fired, even if they knew they were police officers, not following, let's give the benefit of the doubt here to the defendant police officer, did not follow his commands. But the way I looked at it is that car was not a quote-unquote danger. We know there were no weapons inside that vehicle that you can make an argument that it was a weapon was pointed, it was a danger. I mean, it just appeared the gun was pulled out and the kid was shot. Am I missing something?
No, it sure doesn't look like it from the video. And as you said, video evidence isn't all the evidence, but it is very powerful evidence. In this case, you hear what's happening. You see what's happening, at least from that perspective, from that camera. And it is not good for the defense.
Yeah, wow. And again, you could feel bad for the cops. I'm sure he did not wake up that day and say, I want to go shoot and kill somebody. Nevertheless, a young, beautiful teenage boy is dead. And there's consequences to these things, even though it is a tough job. I've seen a lot of police shootings, investigated a lot of police shootings. Haven't seen many where there's just outright no weapons, no nothing, and a shooting inside a moving vehicle in violation of the rules and someone dead. There's a motion going on, Nicole. I started to cut you off there in court right now. Let's see what that one's about. Hello. Kevon Edwards has been admitted as a witness in the case, and he is in the beginning of getting sworn in. So we have a couple of minutes to talk until we get to the real testimony. Nicole, let's flip the script a little bit and put our defense attorney hats on for a moment. So here you go with the cop that's running out there. There's this pandemonium going on. There's pandemonium on his side as well. And while it may not be appropriate to shoot inside the vehicle, you obviously get what's happening, right? They're going to talk about the furtive movements inside the vehicle in combination with the gunshots and thought that maybe he saw something and therefore felt that his life was in danger of the lives of others. Is that your defense in this case?
That and that the vehicle was coming at me and I thought he was trying to run me over. That seems to be where they're headed with this particular defense. You know,
and before we run into court, just one real quick question. A lot of people talk about the idea, this is a jury psychology question, that it's hard to convict police officers. And it's always been my opinion, it's hard because they're given so much discretion in the use of lethal force. But even when they do something that was unintentional in terms of wanting to cause a death, but nevertheless do, I still feel, even myself, as a former prosecutor and law enforcement supporter, right or wrong, this kid's death has to be vindicated, but you can't not feel bad for the cop too. Will one juror feel that way?
You know, it's possible. I mean, police officers have a very hard job to do, and jurors, as a general rule, completely understand and appreciate that fact. And they are in a unique position of going to work every day with a deadly weapon strapped on their clothing so that they can make these decisions and protect people and protect themselves. And that's why they have the discretion that they have. And a lot of times jurors work hard at putting themselves in the shoes of the defendant when they're making these kinds of decisions.
The defendant police officer.
Right.
Absolutely. Okay, let's go into court and see what Kevon has to say. Okay, listen, for those of you who follow the Law and Crime Network, you know beyond a reasonable doubt that perhaps the best or worst person at getting people's names correct is me. And I said Kevon, and it's Kevon. And the only reason for that is my name is Bob Nicole, so if you just keep the vowel in the middle and you move the consonants, it's the same thing. So I don't know. I keep getting the names, but you know, that's bad. That's bad. Kevon deserves to have his name said correctly, and still though, I'm looking to see whether Alan Keller's really in Kentucky or whether or not there's a screenshot behind him and he's making believe he's out there covering a trial. So I don't know. What do you think?
I think we need to check it out. I think we need to ask him some serious questions and see if we can find out for sure that he's there.
Yeah, I actually had a friend of mine in Kentucky kind of sneak by that courtroom to try to find him. I gave him a picture, Aaron, and I got on the phone there because his hair never moves. I said, look for a guy's hair that doesn't move in the wind. He didn't find any of those people there. I'm just saying, Nicole. But all kidding aside, Kevon is up there. Another, it seems like seemingly really decent, well-mannered, respectful, soft-spoken kid. To the extent he's helping the prosecution, I don't think the defense is going to touch this kid either. That's my prediction. What's yours?
I don't don't think so. I mean, the defense has got a lot of risk if they're going to cross-examine a teenager, watch their friend die in a car. You know, that's not going to be popular with anybody unless the teenager does something to earn it. So far, none of these kids have gotten on the stand and been disrespectful, have been sneaky about any of the ways that they have answered any questions. And unless those kids start to do something dramatically different, or Kayvon starts to talk very disrespectfully or refuse to answer questions, they've got to be very careful in how they question him.
Okay, well, this is Texas versus Roy Oliver, 37-year-old police officer on trial for his life right now for the shooting of this young man. We have to go to a break, and on the other end, we'll come back with some more Law and Crime. Welcome back, Law and Crime Network. Hi, Nicole, before we move on, BB314 asked another really interesting question. I'm curious about your thoughts and how things are done out by your end of the way. This is a murder charge. There's a number of aggravated assault counts, and after this alleged murder that he's charged with, they reinvestigated an incident with this police officer in a road rage-related incident that emanated in 2 more now aggravated assault complaints for pulling a weapon out. And his bail, as I understand it, I may have the facts, I think I got the facts right, was $700,000 bond. And when the new charges came out from when they went to reinvestigate the previous incident, it stayed the same. And as you know as well as I do, your chances of being convicted increase exponentially when you're in the jail because of your lack of access to your attorney and resources and so on. It's striking to me because a bail today in the monetary system, we don't have that anymore in Jersey, but in the monetary system used to be $1 million plus in circumstances, and a lot of times it wasn't bonded. What are your thoughts?
Well, in Texas, you're constitutionally entitled to a bail, a reasonable bail, in any case except for a capital murder and certain other very specific circumstances. So this defendant was entitled to a bond. And that's not because he was a police officer. It has nothing to do with anything other than the Constitution and the laws in this state. Now, our bonds aren't typically as high as the ones that you're describing as having been normal in your jurisdiction. You know, the whole purpose of a bond is to make sure that the defendant, the accused, shows up in court and that he does not pose a risk to society, and so therefore can be monitored while he's awaiting his day in court. And so as this case may have been pending, when the new charges came up, they may have decided that he's not a risk for flight and that he has done well and been everywhere we told him to be. There's no reason to raise the bond in this case. He'll show up when we tell him to show up, and we'll have a jury decide what's right.
Yeah, it's been my experience, though, I don't disagree with the thing you said, though, that if this were a person who was not a police officer, and I'll come right out and say it was a person that was a minority, the bail probably would have been higher for this kind of charge. Just been my experience, right or wrong. Hey, listen, we're going to throw to court real quick, and we'll be back on the other end. That is Kayvon Edwards. Didn't get touched. What do you think the value of his testimony was in terms of helping the prosecution?
I think he helped similarly by describing the horror of the scene. It's heartbreaking to hear what he saw and to hear what he heard. It gives you the perspective of the people in that car, and it personalizes the victim in this case. And I think that it's devastating testimony for the defense. Right.
So in terms of the prosecution of this case, you get these witnesses that come on there. You're going to get an expert that's going to come on there. You're going to have a pathologist that's going to get up there and at least go through the dog and pony show of the cause and manner of death. Do you go in clean and fast with this case as a homicide prosecutor, which would be my opinion in this? Because in the end, this is going to be a legal case. It's facts, of course, but there's going to have to be a lot of specific legal issues that have to be resolved.
I think you absolutely go in clean and fast with the expert type witnesses. I think that he's doing the right thing by spending time on these personal type witnesses, because what this prosecutor doesn't want is for this to be a case about police and about just a dead body. He wants it to be about a human being who was killed in a terrible, terrible crime. And so he's done a good job of highlighting that perspective. The defense is going to have to take it back to, this is a police officer who was on duty and ended up shooting someone while he was at work. But so far, the prosecutor's done a good job of personalizing the victim and taking it into the realm of, this is a crime, this is a human being who was dramatically affected, and these are the people who saw it happen.
You know, you bring up a really good point, Nicole, about your cadence as a prosecutor for every case is a little bit different. You know, you can't go into a theft case, for example, or a receiving stolen motor vehicle, and that man right there in front of you, you know, but I used to say to my assistant prosecutors, you got a murder guy there, a rapist or whatever, you get right in their face and you point at them and you let them know, you know, it's your turn now to be on quote unquote the victim of the justice system. But what you bring up an interesting point is a prosecutor with this case, in summation, I think I would be strong, but not as aggressive as I typically would be, and maybe not beating up on the defendant, saying this is the defendant police officer, these are the charges. No one said this is a good thing. The judge is going to read to you the homicide statute. Your job is simply to take the facts of that, superimpose it onto the law, make a decision as to whether it's a guilty or a not guilty, and not have any other concern. If you do that, you can walk away with your conscience clear without necessarily beating them up, because I do think there would be at least one juror sympathetic to these, at least one, to this cop.
Indeed. I mean, everyone thinks that one day they might have an emergency where they have to call police, and police officers, by a vast majority of the community, are regarded as people who come to help. And those are, quite frankly, typically the type of people that serve on jurors, or people with that kind of opinion. So the chances of having a juror who believes that an officer is a person who helps, as a general rule, is very high. And that makes this hurdle quite a bit higher for the prosecution.
And you know, we have a short period of time, and I can talk about this subject, especially with police use of force cases all the time. I believe that there's also a ratcheting up in the community. As prosecutor, I tried very hard to bring the community and the law enforcement community together, because there's been an escalation of violence against police officers, and then back and forth, and there's even heightened tensions, distrust for reasons amongst one another. And I think that makes these things even more like, it's not like the cop just went out there like we have seen recently and just randomly shot a guy running away or anything like that. I think tension has a lot to do with this. Can you give me an answer in 20 seconds or less?
Absolutely, tension has a lot to do with this. This is a case of circumstance. There was a shooting that took place prior to the police officer's actions, and this prosecutor has to separate that incident with the shooting from this officer's reaction to make this thing turn into a crime.
Nicole, we are on the Law and Crime Network. This is a Dan Abrams production. I love being here. I love having guests like you that know the real deal and have been around the block on both sides. Gavel to gavel coverage, folks. I will be back next week, but this is the end of the day. See you soon. God bless.